Joe Louis credits his time training with Bruce Lee as what led to the creation of American Kickboxing. And maybe you've even heard it from Joe Louis himself. Now, it's an interesting story how Bruce Lee and Joe Louis started training together. So I want to tell y'all the truth about Bruce Lee teaching Joe Louis, and I want to knock down some of the myths about their relationship in the process. If you follow the two most popular channels on YouTube for Bruce Lee videos, you've probably heard this story about how Bruce Lee and Joe Louis met in 1967 at Ed Parker's Long Beach International Karate Championships. And the thing is, that's not really what happened at all. And it's unfortunate that both Beerdy, the Bruce Lee Central channel, and the Bruce Lee Real Fight channel have amassed almost a combined 40 million views of spreading this fake story about both Bruce Lee and the late Joe Louis.
Okay, so this is the famous Bruce Lee versus Joe Louis footage.
Bruce Lee invited Joe Louis on stage again to demonstrate the real 1-inch punch.
So if you haven't seen either of their videos, both Beerdy and the Bruce Lee Real Fight channel have made multiple videos where they show this clip of Bruce Lee's 1-inch punch demonstration from 1967, and they claim that Bruce Lee taught it to Joe Louis, or that he demonstrated to Joe Louis how his karate punches were weak compared to Bruce Lee's unstoppable 1-inch punch.
Welcome punch!
But yeah, that's not what happened at all. So let's talk about how Bruce Lee and Joe Louis really met. Now, it's hard to say when they met because, well, we don't really have a date for that meeting. And all of these guys, Joe Louis, Bruce Lee, and Chuck Norris, well, they all seem to arrive on the scene at around the same time at about 1964. Now, a lot of the karate champions that you might know from around that time, they were guys who were getting out of the military, as they had all seemed to serve in Asia right in between the Korean War and just before the U.S. entered the Vietnam War in 1965. Now, Joe Louis, he really didn't hit the scene until around 1966 when he won the U.S. Nationals that were promoted by June Rhee by defeating 7 opponents before he defeated Thomas Carroll to win the championship. Now, June Rhee and Bruce Lee were very close friends, so if I had to make a wager on this, I would say that Bruce Lee first became aware of Joe Louis in 1966 when Joe won the Grand Championship at that tournament. Now, Bruce and Joe, they first really met at the office of Black Belt magazine. Joe was there to complain about his name being misspelled, and I'll wager a guess and say that they accidentally spelled it like the former heavyweight boxing champion of the same name.
The Brown Bomber! Now that was a great boxer!
Bruce just happened to be at Black Belt magazine at the same time, and he proceeded to follow Joe outside of the parking lot, where he spoke with Joe for about 30 minutes all about Jeet Kune Do.
What is this thing you do?
In Cantonese, Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist.
Intercepting fist, huh?
Or foot.
How it was superior to what Joe was training, and how JKD could take what he was doing in these point sparring tournaments to the next level.
And it just all went in one ear and out the other.
Well, at the same time, Joe kind of looked at Kung Fu guys as little twerps who waved their hands around in the air and they didn't fight. I mean, here he is, a Marine Corps veteran standing at 6 foot, 195 pounds, and he wasn't about to listen to some small Chinese guy that he outweighed by at least 50 pounds who wasn't fighting in the same tournaments as him. So if I'm placing that meeting at Black Belt magazine at around 1966, after Joe Louis won June Rhee's U.S. Nationals, well, then what happened at Ed Parker's Long Beach International Tournament in 1967? I mean, didn't Bruce Lee teach Joe Louis the 1-inch punch in his demonstration after Joe Louis tried to teach karate to Bruce Lee? I mean, isn't that what Beerdy said?
And when it came time to perform the 6-inch punch, Joe Louis actually stepped up and said, hold on, I'm the champion here. Let me demonstrate a karate punch.
Well, no, that's not what happened at all. So from what I've been able to dig up, it sounds like there was a tournament held on the first day of the event and then exhibitions and demonstrations held on the second day. So on the first day of fighting, Joe Louis defeated Chuck Norris's brother Waylon Norris, Steve LeBounty, Frank Knoll, and Frank Hargrove. Bruce Lee was the guest of honor at Ed Parker's tournament, as he was Kato by this point. So by this time in Bruce's career, like, people would come out to these big tournaments just to see Bruce's demonstration, and then a lot of them would leave. So Bruce's demonstration consisted of the blindfolded Chisao with Taki Komura, the feats of strength like the 2-finger push-ups, the continuous sparring with Dan Inosanto and James Lee, and of course, the 1-inch and 6-inch punch demonstration as the coup de grace. So for that demonstration, Bruce Lee had his friend and student Bob Baker assist. And Bob Baker, well, he isn't really our most favorite student of Bruce's. That's if you saw the drug letters video. But anyway, as part of the demonstration, we see this guy in a red trimmed gi wearing a red belt demonstrate a punch from his style of martial arts. And then Bruce demonstrated the 1-inch punch on that guy in the gi. Now, I need to be clear and say that this guy is not Joe Louis. Bob Baker was around 5'10", 170 pounds, and he's clearly taller than Bruce Lee and the man in the gi. And the man in the gi looks to be around the same size as Bruce Lee. I mean, I just told you guys, Joe Louis was 6 foot tall, 195 pounds with some muscle on him. He liked to lift weights, he wrestled in college, and he was in the Marine Corps. And there's no way that that little guy is Joe Louis. On top of that, his gi looks like an American Tang Soo Do uniform. And guess who else was given an exhibition on that very same day? Chuck Norris, the guy who started American Tang Soo Do.
So after the footage, after this video, after this incident, Joe Louis and Bruce Lee became really good friends.
So Bruce Lee didn't teach Joe Louis the 1-inch punch at the Long Beach International Tournament. But it was because of that Long Beach International Tournament that they did eventually start to train together. So do you guys remember in the drug letters video how I said that Bruce arrived on the scene in 1963, and that's when he met Ed Parker and a bunch of other big wigs on the West Coast martial arts scene? Well, Ed Parker was so impressed with a young Bruce Lee that he handed a wad of cash to his student, Dan Inosanto, and he told Dan to look after Bruce because he was pretty much throwing him on the stage to present him to the world at the 1964 Long Beach International Tournament. And at the 1964 tournament, Bruce Lee would meet Mike Stone. At that time, there were 4 big names when it came to winning karate tournaments. It was Mike Stone, Chuck Norris, Joe Louis, and Vic Moore. And we're going to be talking about Vic Moore in another video because he's been disrespected way too much by these other so-called Bruce Lee experts that are here on YouTube. But anyway, we know how this goes. Bruce Lee would end up training the other 3 guys, Mike Stone, Joe Louis, and Chuck Norris. And see, these guys, they all kind of ran together, meaning Joe, Chuck, and Mike. They were all kind of connected through Bob Wall, mostly through businesses that were involved with running their respective dojos. Well, Mike Stone, Joe Louis, and Bob Wall, these guys were all trying to break into Hollywood, so they had some kind of an act that they performed in nightclubs, and the act always concluded with a short karate demonstration or a sparring session. Well, at some point, Joe noticed that Mike was moving differently, like he picked up some new moves from somewhere. So when Joe asked Mike about this new stuff he was doing, well, Mike told him that he'd been working out with this Chinese guy, Bruce Lee. He told him that Bruce had been wanting to get in touch with Joe because, well, he was interested in working out with him. So after that, Joe Louis started training with Bruce Lee in January of 1968. I think it was January 28th of 68. So look, y'all, here's why that date is important. It's because Chuck Norris beat Joe Louis at the All-American Karate Tournament in 1967 at Madison Square Garden, and Bruce Lee had a ringside seat for that fight.
We're in the hallway working out. Now this is at midnight, and we worked out till 4 o'clock that morning.
And that's the tournament where Chuck Norris claims that he stayed up all night teaching high kicks to Bruce Lee in his hotel room.
Stop the cap. Stop the cap right now.
But what happened after that was Chuck Norris started taking lessons from Bruce Lee starting in October of 1967. So peep game, y'all. Like, Joe Louis sees these 2 guys, Chuck Norris and Mike Stone, working out with Bruce Lee. The dude he'd blown off for being this little Chinese guy who couldn't fight. At least so he thought back then. Now Chuck starts seeing Bruce Lee after beating Joe Louis, and Mike has all these new moves, and on top of that, I mean, this guy was freaking Kato. He's starting to train celebrities. Like, even Frank Sinatra is interested in learning a little bit of Kung Fu from Bruce Lee. So Joe Louis goes to see what this guy's all about. If for nothing else, well, maybe Bruce can at least help him break into Hollywood. Well, unfortunately, Joe Louis didn't make it into Hollywood. Bruce did get Joe, Mike, and Chuck on the set of The Wrecking Crew where they were doing work. But not long after that, Joe Louis and Mike Stone had a falling out with Bruce Lee. And of course, we know that Joe Louis felt that his time with Bruce Lee was beneficial. It did improve his martial art. And it's what led to him eventually walking away from point sparring and fight in the first full contact karate match, which would eventually become American Kickboxing.
I think he helped accelerate my career, helped me defeat all the top guys in competition at that time, and helped me go back and think about getting away from point fighting, putting full contact back on the map.
As for Bruce Lee, well, I mean, what was in it for him? Why would he want to train Joe Louis, Mike Stone, and Chuck Norris for free? Well, at one point in time, Bruce wanted to create this super kung fu style and then open schools all across the United States. After the Green Hornets run had ended, Bruce established himself as the Sifu to the stars.
To me, okay, to me, ultimately, martial art means honestly expressing yourself. Now, it is very difficult to do.
But to really establish himself as the best teacher in America, he needed these martial arts champions to also call him Big Brother. Now that goes back to those days running the streets with his gang in Hong Kong. He ran into William Chung, who was studying with Ip Man, and Bruce had to go start learning Wing Chun in order to one-up William Chung and make William call Bruce his big brother because that's not what happened after William kicked his butt. So that's why Bruce wanted to teach Joe Louis. There was no showing him up at the Ed Parker's tournaments. Look, this is just another one of those, this is how it really happened when it comes to Bruce Lee, the man and the myth. And hey y'all, I'm really sorry that there's no Grandmaster Baxter getting 1-inch punched across the stage. There's no Jim Kelly and Bruce Lee going on a road trip to beat up karate masters in their dojos all over America. But look, if y'all like learning interesting facts about Bruce Lee while I debunk these crazy stories from the Beerdy-Bruce Lee channel and the Real Fight Bruce Lee channel, look, y'all be sure to check out these videos. But hey, y'all keep training, remember to breathe, and I'll see you on the next video.